Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Warm welcome to our in-person audience. We have to specify in-person and remote. These days, we have a remote audience as well joining us, and we'll be taking questions both from the online and from the in-person audience. I'm Ed Schatz. I'm the director of the Center for European and Eurasian Studies here at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. And on behalf of CEAS and the Petr Yatsik Program for the Study of Ukraine, it is an absolute honor to introduce Yaroslav Trofimov. He's somebody who I'm sure for this audience, but not just for this audience, genuinely needs no introduction, but he gets one anyway. Yaroslav is, as you'll know, the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, a post that he's held since 2018. Before that, he was the journal's bureau chief in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He's the author of three books of nonfiction, including the absolutely astounding Our Enemies Will Vanish, which is the most recent, there's going to be an asterisk to this in a second, most recent publication, and it covers the first year of Russia's war in Ukraine. That was published by Penguin in 2024. I've got a copy over there. Other people may have copies. I think Yaroslav will be signing them if folks have it with them. This book was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for Political Writing. It was recent, you may not even know this, recently shortlisted for the Peterson Literary Prize. Okay, you did know this. And having just finished the book, I can tell you why it receives these kinds of accolades. The writing is accessible, it is careful, it is evocative, and it's deeply gripping. And Yaroslav, it'll come as no surprise to folks in the audience, himself is absolutely fearless in his professionalism and his dedication to documenting one of the most horrifying stories of this century. And it's a masterclass of what my writing teacher once upon a time used to call show, don't tell, right? That is, let the evidence speak for itself. And of course, the evidence does indeed, in this case, speak for itself. Twice, Yaroslav has been the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting, and somehow he has also managed to publish a new novel. Here it is, No Country for Love, that has received already glowing reviews from publications in the UK, the Sunday Times, the Economist, and so on. It has not yet been released in North America. That's why we can't say anything about the reviews yet in the North American context, but it's coming out
in February.
In February. Okay, fantastic. Yaroslav not only has a great depth of knowledge about Ukraine and the ongoing war, but given his reporting on the Middle East and Afghanistan and Pakistan, he has a wealth of comparative frameworks to help us to understand conflict, to understand great power politics, and to understand life in all of its texture and all of its nuance during wartime. Now, today's discussion is a forward-leaning one, right? So we're going to be discussing what comes next in Ukraine's War of Independence. I'll ask you to tell us why you give it that name, War of Independence, just to sort of unpack that. But before I invite Yaroslav to say a few words just about sort of his professional trajectory and how he comes to both his journalistic work and also his recent fiction that he has been engaged in. Just a couple things of housekeeping. There will be, some of you may have received cue cards, index cards and pencils. These are for you to write questions. And the folks over here on my left will, at a precise moment that we haven't determined yet, but it will happen. They will come around and collect cue cards, and we will get to as many questions as we can. Those who are joining us remotely, you can put your questions in the Q&A function. There's probably a button there, and I will have a chance to look at those as well. And just given the size of the audience, both here and at home, we'll get to just as many questions as we can. Please write legibly. That goes without saying, but if it's not legible, it's hard to ask the question, right? And also mention if you're a student, because we give priority around here to our students, okay? So put that in writing. So what we decided is that we give Yaroslav the floor for a brief introduction, as long as he feels inspired, and then we'll have a bit of a back and forth about the next year, what's to come in Ukraine's War of Independence, and then we'll open it up to the broader audience. And as I mentioned before, Yaroslav has kindly agreed to sign books afterwards, so if you did bring your book, then there's an opportunity there. Please welcome Yaroslav Trofimov.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the very generous introduction. I was born in Ukraine, in Kyiv, but I left Ukraine in 1990. And I have been working for the Wall Street Journal since the 20th century, 1999, and most of my career was covering other people's wars, other people's tragedies in other countries. So I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Middle East, and in many other conflicts around Africa. And Ukraine was very different for me. And I'll tell you a little bit how I came back to covering this war. So roll back to the summer of 2021. It's the summer of the American retreat from Afghanistan. And I went back there to cover the fall of the American-installed Afghan Republic. And I remember walking through Kabul on August 14th, 2021, and watching how President Ashraf Ghani was touring the troops in the outskirts of the city and saying, "We will fight, we will never surrender." And then the next morning, he was in a helicopter flying to Abu Dhabi, and the Taliban were literally in my hotel in Kabul. And within days of that, they were driving American Humvees and MRAPs, and by the end of the month, they were flying American Black Hawks in Kabul. And this is the image that affected everyone in the world, especially so in the US government. Because at the time, Ukraine was pleading for weapons, pleading for military assistance, but the answer was, well, your fight is doomed, you will collapse in a few days. Why would you give you, would we give you anything, because the Russians will have it. And I came back to Afghanistan and drove around and visited under the Taliban. And in January, I came to Ukraine. And as the clouds were gathering over the country of my birth, and I was really puzzled by the question of whether Ukraine will fight, whether Ukraine will resist. And I remember traveling throughout eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, through the places where there was a genuine degree of pro-Russian feeling back in 2014, and being surprised by how little of that remained after the 8-year experiment of Russian occupation in Donetsk and Luhansk really showed people what this Russian world means, and that it didn't mean prosperity, it didn't mean higher salaries, it meant gangland ruled by thugs who expropriated properties, destroyed the economy, and actually, the people of Donetsk and Luhansk had fled, and they voted with their feet, but 2/3 of them had fled Russian-occupied areas to the rest of Ukraine, to Europe, to Russia by the beginning of the full-scale war. So, everyone in Kharkiv knew someone who had to flee this Russian world. But the other question I had as the war began was, what if President Zelensky pulls off a Ghani? What if he too listens to advice that he was receiving at the time from very well-meaning quarters, including the White House, including the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, to get on a helicopter and leave? Because again, everybody was expecting this war to be very short and very unsuccessful for Ukraine. And the day before the war, and this is the beginning of this book, is I went to see President Poroshenko, who was the former president of Ukraine, and we had a very sort of polite conversation over espresso in his beautiful office, and then he leaned towards me and whispered in my ear, the war will be tomorrow at 4 a.m. If you want to leave the country, this is your time. And lots of people did. Lots of private jets took off from Kyiv that day. And then the war began. And President Zelensky did not listen to advice. I'm talking in the book, about how Boris Johnson called him and said, your safety is everybody's first priority. You should follow the example of the Polish government in 1939 that set up in London. You should do the same. And he refused. People who came to him asking him to move even out of his presidential office in Vankova, were told, repeat it again and I will fire you on the spot. And that first day of the war was really touch and go, because there was chaos in the city. And there is a saying that I remember reading as a child in some French existential novel, and I've tried to Google it and couldn't find the source, but it says that at war, people's character opens up like a tin can, and you can see what's inside. And people in Ukraine didn't know how people next to them will react to this stress of full time. Well, they didn't know how they themselves will react, and I think they surprised themselves at the time with the courage, with the determination, and this decision to fight despite overwhelming odds. We'll forget it now, but no one really, except maybe for the Polish government, gave Ukraine much of a chance at the time. Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, until recently told me that he was in Washington 2 days before the full-scale invasion. He went to see President Biden. He went to see people in the White House, and he felt like he was being given handshakes and warm smiles and a sort of diagnosis of incurable terminal cancer. So it was sort of the last wishes for him and for Ukraine as a state, because President Putin has made. Is not really disguised his goal, which remains his goal all along, to destroy Ukraine as a separate nation, as separate people, as he thinks Ukraine is Russia. And so where are we now? Year 3. We are not talking about Russian tanks in Kyiv. We're not talking about a Russian-installed government in Ukraine. We're not talking about an insurgency. We're talking about whether Russia will be able to maybe seize, 1 or 2 more towns in Donbass in the next, before the end of the year. Will Pokrovsk fall, not fall? If you look at where the front lines are now, they haven't really moved in a significant manner since November 2022. 2 or 3 towns in Donbass have fallen. Russia tried to advance north of Kharkiv, didn't really succeed, and then Ukraine had this major psychological and possibly military breakthrough, invading Russia and occupying a part of the Kursk region. But I think what is becoming increasingly clear is that despite this strategic victory, because we're not talking about Ukraine losing its independence now. We're talking about a war that will define, where Ukraine's final, or at least de facto temporary borders will lie, and will Ukraine be able to return all of its territories, or will it have to sacrifice some of them? It's some sort of settlement imposed from the outside. But we're not talking about the end to Ukrainian statehood, because as the invasion of the Kursk region has shown, Russia just doesn't have the military force and the reserves to go all the way to Kyiv. I mean, there's still, the Kursk was invaded in August. We're now at the end of October, and Ukraine is still controlling the majority of the land it had taken there. But we're also seeing that the price that Ukrainians are paying in lives and treasure is very high. So are the Russians, but there is just more manpower in Russia. And in this war of attrition that we are seeing in the Donbass, slowly but surely the Russians are advancing. They're losing, thousands, tens of thousands of men for every little town, but they are still doing it. And I think there is a growing realization in Ukraine that the war in Ukraine cannot be won in Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine has to be taken to Russia, taken to the Russian homeland, and the rules of the game have to be changed. And that's why, on one hand, we saw this land invasion of Russia, but on the other hand, we're seeing more and more long-range strikes into Russia. The U.S. has not allowed American-supplied missiles to be used for strikes deep inside Russia, but Ukraine has developed its own capacity that is more and more powerful. There are drones that can fly more than 1,000 miles, and there have been stunning successes in striking Russian ammunition facilities, strategic reserves, strategic fuel reserves, military air bases. And there are many other targets that Ukraine has not touched yet, such as Russian energy export facilities that really like provide the lifeblood of the Russian state. And they haven't done that because of political constraints from the West. But these political constraints are a quid pro quo, right? Ukraine is receiving assistance, it's receiving military assistance. And in exchange for that assistance, it is playing by the rules that favor the US and other Western nations that back it, for whom keeping oil prices at a reasonably low level is a bigger priority than Ukraine's welfare. And so Ukraine is not striking the Russian oil export in infrastructure. But if the political environment changes after the U.S. election, we have already seen that in the beginning of this year, when American aid dried up, Ukraine started attacking Russian refineries. And so I think the big question is how will this taking the war to Russia will look like if America drops much of its support for Ukraine, and what will be all the options of Ukraine as a sovereign state in that case?
Okay, terrific. I think that gets us started. I have a series of questions.
I hope
Many
so.
questions. Okay. So let's actually warm into it. Let's maybe start with the first year of the war just a little bit before we launch kind of into year 3, year 2, and year 3. Because it strikes me, just having read this book, that there were so many. You talk about it being touch and go, right? I mean, you specifically were talking about Zelensky in the first day. But reading the whole book, it strikes me that there were so many contingent moments where, had it gone just this much differently, right, something significant could have changed in the course of the war. And I wonder how, if I can invite you to speculate on like which of, thinking back on that first year, can you think of 2 or 3 most significant contingent moments where, had things gone just a little bit differently, we could have been in a very different space?
Yeah, I think the 2 pivotal moments are the very beginning of the war, the Russian attempt to take over Hostomel airfield west of Kyiv, and then this late summer of 2022. So what happened on day 1 of the first morning of the war? Several dozen Russian helicopters with their best elite airborne troops were flying from Belarus over the Kyiv Sea in a sort of very broad reservoir, avoiding detection by air defenses, then pivoted left and landed at Hostomel airfield, which is a very large airfield used by normally by the Antonov aircraft manufacturer. So Ukraine had warning ahead of time. Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, had come to Kyiv to tell Zelensky personally that one of the Russian plans would be to land troops at Hostomel. And the Russian plan was not just to land these troops by helicopter, it was to seize the landing strip and then to bring in large transport planes with heavy fighting vehicles and thousands, maybe 2 or 3 brigades of Russia's best forces, the Russian VDV airborne. Because of the warning, because of the intelligence, Ukraine had troops guarding it. And these troops dispersed from the barracks the morning of the first day of the war to take positions in the airfield. Within an hour of them leaving the barracks, Russian missiles slammed into these barracks. And so if they hadn't left the building, they'd probably be mostly dead or injured. There wasn't a lot of them. There was a few hundred. They were mostly conscripts of the National Guard. They didn't have any Stingers or any of the sophisticated American weapons. Though some had been provided to Ukraine before the war, the numbers were very, very small. But they held that airfield long enough for reinforcements to arrive, for artillery to arrive, to shell the landing strip, and at the end of the day, none of these Russian planes managed to land. And the small Russian force that was holding the airfield managed to hold out in that airfield, but it was never used as an airfield by the Russians. And I think this was had the Russians been able to land, 2 or 3 brigades there, the road to Kyiv was open. I remember driving from the Hyatt Hotel in the heart of Kyiv to Hostomel and on a normal day it takes 40 minutes. That morning, there was no one in the streets. Everything was empty. People were fleeing. It took maybe 10 minutes, and there was no one. There were no barricades, no soldiers. Everything was just coalescing and started to take shape. So that's one big pivotal point, and the Russians were looking back pretty close to pulling it off. And I think the other point was another road not taken in this case, and unfortunately, was when Ukraine launched its big offensive in Kherson and Kharkiv in August, September 2022. At the time, Ukraine had a numerical superiority. It had maybe 3 times more troops in Ukraine than Russia did, because President Putin refused the request of his generals to carry out a mobilization. So, because doing so would have meant accepting that the special military operation was not really going to plan. So Russia had only about 100,000 troops in Ukraine. But it had an advantage in ammunition, it had an advantage in gear. And Ukraine was begging for supplies. It was begging for tanks, for air defenses, for fighter jets, for multiple launch rocket systems. And it was all denied. It was all denied because of these imaginary Russian red lines. Oh my God, if there'll be German tanks on Ukrainian soil, then there'll be nuclear strikes. And so when Ukraine managed to break through Russian lines and managed to liberate the majority of the Kharkiv region and then push into Kherson, it, on one hand, ran out of stuff with which to go ahead. And on the other hand, Putin just intensified, once again, his nuclear saber rattling. And that was the moment where people around Washington really convinced that he's very close to pushing the button, which would, in retrospect, we now know this was not the case, and they were deliberately having these conversations, knowing that they listened to. It was all part of his scaremongering, which really worked really well, because even though this nuclear blackmail did not stop Western assistance to Ukraine. And this blackmail started on day one of the war, when Putin made his big TV speech when the war began. He said, if you dare to interfere in my special military operation, you will see the kind of things you have never seen in your lifetimes. So it didn't stop the assistance, but it throttled it enough to not be nearly as efficient as it could have been, and it deprived Ukraine of this historical opportunity, because then Putin mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops. They, put all the resources into digging fortifications. And, the next year, when Ukraine did receive all this assistance, and all the tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles and you name it, it was just too late. And, and now, Russia has more people on the front lines than Ukraine.
No, that strikes me. I mean, that comes from the book, and that strikes me as entirely plausible. I do have a question on on the imaginary red lines, because I mean, I think that it's clear, especially retrospectively. I mean, I wasn't on the ground, and I have gotten so many things wrong about this war, so probably should take whatever I have to say with a giant lump of salt. Having said that, I think that there is an element of keeping the Western coalition together that might have been harder, at least, if they had ignored the imaginary red lines. In other words, is that a fair point? I mean, realizing that that's not the main thing here, but what would have happened to that effort to keep this cobbled together coalition together, right, of Western powers, which is really unanimous? Would have it started to experience fragilities?
I don't think so. I mean, if you look at the coalition, okay, so what happened, right? So I think, first of all, in the very beginning, the U.S. Underestimated the resolve of the Europeans. And there was a paper written by some of the people who were working in the National Security Council in the U.S. at the time. And when the very first reaction of the Europeans was to cut off Russia from SWIFT, the international banking system, on the day 2 of the invasion, they were in shock, because that was 5 steps up the imaginary escalatory ladder that they had in Washington. So the big surprise was that the Europeans actually cut off their dependence on Russian gas very quickly. And the traditional supporters of Ukraine, not just the Baltic states and Poland and the Scandinavians, very quickly saw that the French and the Brits and the Dutch and then increasingly the Germans are moving towards their side. So the key was always in Washington. The moment the U.S. decided to supply Abrams tanks, the German chancellor sent Leopards. In the very, very, very beginning of the war, Poland offered to send its MiG fighter jets, and it's the U.S. that told them no, because what will Putin think? So, no, I disagree with that. And, okay, I mean, in a nuclear conflict, you cannot take nuclear threats lightly, obviously. But this went against the other principle of, if you use nuclear blackmail for territorial conquest, where does it end, right? If Putin can say, Zaporizhia is Russian, dare to take it back from me, and I'll nuke you, what if he says, Berlin is Russian? Or what if he says, Rome is Russian? So, I mean, and there was a test there, right? So when he made these threats in October 2022 by annexing, 4 Ukrainian regions and saying this is Russian territory and I will use all means at my disposal to defend it, and Ukraine said, okay, well, and called its bluff, and actually retook Kherson and retook parts of Donetsk. I think this really exposed the hollowness of these nuclear threats. And we saw now, like Ukraine invaded Russia in August this year. I mean, he actually sent German tanks into sovereign Russian territory, and nothing happened.
No, that's fair. And it's probably worth adding that in any hypothetical, God forbid, nuclear confrontation, Ukrainians would be the ones to suffer immediately. So if Ukrainians are willing to fight under these kinds of conditions and cross so-called red lines, it would seem that would be their choice, probably more than anybody else's to make. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about, one other way to read this is principally and of course beautifully a grounded account, grounded in the Ukrainian kind of context. So it's not really about Russia, as such. But the narrative, I think, that we get in the media of the first few months is of Russia total incompetence, right, in prosecuting this war. I mean, starting from, poor intelligence, whether Putin was, so isolated because of fears of COVID, only listening to a few advisors. I mean, the whole, and it makes some sense. But then there's some point where there's some actual learning that seems to be happening on the Russian side, and Russia begins to learn to prosecute this war differently. Can you say a little bit about what they learned and whether that's effective? I mean, are they a competent fighting force, or is it simply just sending bodies to the front line, without any concern for human life?
Yeah, the Russian military today is a very competent fighting force, and I think there are only 2 militaries in the world right now that actually know how to fight peer-to-peer warfare in modern, with modern technologies. It's the Russian and Ukrainian military, because the U.S. military has not fought a peer or near-peer force since Korea, I guess, in the 50s. And that is a fact that I think is very much underestimated, especially in the U.S. If you look at how much the drone technology has evolved, continues to evolve, every 3 weeks things change. Things that worked 3 weeks ago don't work anymore. And these lessons are not being learned by other Western militaries, in part because they're just not there. Now, if you look at what happened to the Russian military since the beginning, the war was launched because of a very false premise. Because Putin really thought that Ukraine is Russia, the Ukrainians are Russians who are sort of misguided by some sort of Western installed elite, and they will not fight. So when the Russian military invaded, they did not expect to fight. They expected Ukrainian soldiers to switch sides to them. And so they thought that all the Ukrainian air defenses suppressed. And so, in fact, Russian aircraft and Russian troops were operating under the idea that anything they see in the skies is friendly. And so, and they paid a very expensive price for this in the first days of the war. But they learned, and First, they realized they need a lot more people, so they had this giant reserve of prisoners, and they've emptied the prison camps to send disposable soldiers, which was a useful tactic because that does work. I mean, they advance in small groups. You have 8 guys going to take a tree line, 3 of them survive, but then another 8 come and they keep going. And at the same time, nobody really mourns the killing of rapists and murderers. So it's kind of a win-win for the system. I think their drone technology is much better, and I think the electronic warfare is much improved. A lot of the Western systems, like the HIMARS, especially the Excalibur rounds, is the precision-guided artillery that used to be very efficient in the beginning. Just doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't explode. HIMARS used to be able to hit, within a couple of meters of the target. And now they just go sideways and miss the targets very often.
And what is happening? Where are they missing their targets?
Oh, because there is a lot of Russian electronic warfare that is just messing up with the guidance systems, messing up with the GPS signal. The problem is that while Ukrainian-made weapons are being adjusted to this threat all the time, whatever they get from the West just comes done, and you cannot fix it. And so that is a big, big problem. While the Russians are learning, the Western manufacturers are not necessarily. And then I think the Russian decision-making cycle has shortened. In the past, they would be able to see a target, and they needed, days sometimes to hit it. Now they have a drone, they see something, and a ballistic missile flies in 30 minutes later. They're able to hit, planes the moment they land in the airfield, 100 miles from the front line. So yes, they are becoming much better.
Okay, so some learning is occurring, not necessarily the learning that one might want to see. I want to ask you about something else that I think, in a way, it comes up in the book, but then I think it gets us into questions about the second and now the third year of the war, and that has to do with, I guess, public opinion, right, in the Ukrainian context. I mean, especially in the Russian-speaking areas. I mean, you talked about how in 2014, maybe before the annexation of Crimea and then the start of the war, there would have been some genuine sympathy on the part of Russian-speaking populations in these spaces for whatever they thought Russia represented to them, right? And what comes up again and again, at least in the academic side of things, is that has almost evaporated entirely. It was a more gradual story, but of course, with the full-scale invasion, it seems to have brought people together. And I wonder if you can say, I mean, there's some really evocative examples from people that you meet. I'm trying to remember a mayor in I think
Kharkiv,
in Kharkiv, in Kharkiv. You could say a little bit about that. But so I guess that's the first question. Sort of how does that occur? And I guess how deep was, as it turns out, the feeling for Russia in the first place? Was it just incompetence all around? I speak Russian, and so therefore maybe I place my bets with Russia, and then they attack me, and so now I'm no longer interested? Is it as simple as that?
I think there's several layers to this. I think first of all, okay, let's roll back to who are the Russian speakers of Ukraine? I mean, many of them had Ukrainian-speaking parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, and they became Russian speakers because of the Russification of education and the workplace, but didn't change what the roots are, right? I think Russia before 2014 was not seen as an enemy by a lot of people, most people in Ukraine. And President Zelensky at the time was a showman on Russian state television. He was actually the host of the New Year's show on New Year's morning 2014 on Russia, the main Russian TV channel, as the Maidan revolution was already underway in Kyiv. So, and Russia was seen as, a less corrupt country with much higher salaries, lots of Ukrainians from all over Ukraine, including Lviv, who used to go and work in the gas field in Russia. And that image was shattered by the lived experience of Russian occupation in Donbass, where everybody could see what it is. And it was shattered even more by what happened after February 2022. And this conversation you referred to that I had with the mayor of Kharkiv, Igor Terehov, who made a point of never speaking Ukrainian, by the way, until recently, and who was famous before the war for his campaign to restore the name of Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet military commander, to Kharkiv's main street. Basically, what would happen is that the courts would rule that he has to rename it, and the courts would rename it, and then would rename it back to Zhukov, and it would go back and forth, doing this ping pong with the courts for years. And so Terekhov was telling me that, look, I mean, our attitude to Russia has changed 180 degrees. And in fact, it's the people in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine that are now the most, sort of fervent foes of Russia, have this sort of blood feud with Russia, for the very simple reason is that it is their houses, is their homes, it's their cities, it's their families that are being obliterated by Russian shelling. In Kharkiv, in Severodonetsk, in Mariupol, in all the cities, in Mykolaiv. Whereas, luckily for the people in Western Ukraine, who are used to be seen as, as this reservoir of anti-Russian feeling, luckily for them, they mostly see war on television. And I think that's a very profound lived experience. I mean, if you go to Kharkiv, the entire northern part of Kharkiv has been smashed into pulp by Russian artillery point blank for several months. And so I think it's kind of pointless now to talk about the these East-West divisions in Ukraine. Also because Russian is a language spoken on the front lines. A lot of soldiers will find it easier to speak Russian. I found it actually a really interesting thing because there is a political switch. So people want to speak Ukrainian. And lots of people who spoke Russian in public speak Ukrainian in the restaurant, in a coffee shop, in a social setting. But when they are on the front line, where every split second matters, they switch back to Russian just because it's easier to survive in a language in which you think faster.
Yeah, on the language front, I mean, I can say as somebody who works on other parts of former Soviet space, on Central Asia, there's been a shift even among the Russophone populations, at least in public. Hard to know what they're doing in their kitchens, or nobody's on the front lines and so on. But in public, palpable change where people speak, prefer to speak Kazakh or Uzbek or whatever.
Hey, I have a friend who was a former Kyrgyz ambassador, and they're now living in Europe. And I always spoke with him in Russian because it was his mother tongue. Yeah. But now he and his wife are raising a child in Europe, and their express goal is to make sure the child does not speak any Russian. Which is kind of interesting.
No, quite a shift. So, okay, on the question of public opinion, and this I think gets us past the first year. I mean, it strikes me as pretty clear that Putin's calculation, I mean, several calculations, once he made the fateful sort of misstep of starting this in the first place, which I think he backed himself into. In any case, is counting on exhaustion at some point to set in among the general public. So, I mean, one other way to think about a public opinion shift is not, I'm going to prefer Russia over Ukraine, but rather I'm going to acquiesce to some kind of notion of an inevitable fate, which is that I can't, this is too exhausting, right? So at what point does the exhaustion about the war set in, or has it, or is that the wrong way to frame the question in the first place? Because it's certainly one of the ways that I think it's framed in the West.
Yeah, I mean, there are two kinds of exhaustion, right? There's exhaustion in Ukraine among the people actually doing the fighting and the dying. It is a fact. I mean, people are exhausted. It's been almost 3 years of war. Very many people have died or been maimed, and there was an opinion poll in July that I think really kind of showed the dilemma that Ukraine has. There were two questions there. The first question was how do you see the war ending? How do you want the war to end? What is your end goal? And as expected, like 90-something% said, we want to return to at least either the borders of 1991 or at the very least the borders of February 2022. But then there was another question, and it was very simple. It said, do you think that dodging the draft is immoral? And only about 1/3 said yes. And which means that 2/3 of Ukrainians kind of think it's okay if my spouse, my neighbor, my child doesn't get drafted and doesn't get sent to Donbass, where the odds of surviving after 3 years in one piece are actually not very high, as we know, because it's a one-way ticket. People very rarely get released from the service unless they get injured. And I think this is an issue that is a political issue because these two positions have to be reconciled. Either you accept a political solution that is not optimal, or there has to be a lot more effort by people to go and serve, which we're not observing right now. Like Ukraine's supply of people is not limitless. Now, if we look at the exhaustion in the West, I think the Russian narrative and what they're banking on is a narrative of futility. So what the Russian propaganda sort of networks are spreading is a narrative that Ukraine is losing, it's going to lose anyway, and don't throw good money after bad, and therefore, just let the Russians take it over. Kind of look what happened to you in Afghanistan. Which is why Ukraine's ability to actually change the narrative and to go into Russia, in Kursk was very important because it reset the narrative, and suddenly Russia was looking like it's not invincible as people started to think again. But we are at the crossroads now. I mean, there will be an election in the United States in 3 weeks. And, former President Trump, has been very skeptical of further aid to Ukraine. If he does win the election, there will be meaningful changes. And the question then is, to what extent will other allies of Ukraine be willing and able to step up?
Yeah, no, that's fair, and gets back to this coalition, of course, with the United States playing an oversized role. I mean, well, I guess one possibility, and I should preface this by saying, I'm no Trump fan, and I genuinely expect not the best from that man, were he to be elected. That said, I guess there's another possibility, which is, I mean, I think the more likely possibility is that he would negotiate away, right? That he would try to orchestrate some kind of a deal which would not be favorable to Ukraine. But there's potentially another possibility, which is that he would say there are no red lines, right? That we need to end this decisively in a different kind of way. Again, if I'm betting, I'm thinking that that's probably less likely. But let's back up just a tiny bit, because I guess the question about the no red line, like did the Biden administration, what did the Biden administration get right? And what did it get wrong?
Well, I mean, what the Biden administration got right is that it did manage to assemble this coalition of allies and partners, and there is a unity of the West, well, except Hungary maybe, but Hungary acquiesces at the end when it comes to Ukraine. All of that happened kind of by accident because they didn't plan for it. I mean, the idea was that Ukraine will not exist. I mean, one of the talks I gave last week, my moderator, who's now a professor, was seconded to the State Department at the time, and her job was to prepare the plan of action of how the U.S. will build relations with the new puppet government that Russia will install in Kyiv. That was the planning at the time. But very quickly, once the conflict began, the Biden administration did move in the right direction. Ukrainians would tell you not nearly fast enough or boldly enough, but obviously without the help that is very large in absolute terms that had been provided until now, Ukraine probably would not have been able to hold the ground, to hold the line. Now, your question about Trump, look, it's very hard to predict what he will do. A, because he probably himself doesn't have clear ideas, but B, there are people around him who have very different ideas from each other. If you listen to what Mike Pompeo or many Republicans in the Senate are saying, they are far more determined and bold than the current administration. There are others, like J.D. Vance, who just, want to wash their hands off Ukraine and hand it over to Russia. And so what would the policy be? Would I know? But the fact is that, the Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives did vote for this massive aid package for Ukraine this year, and President Trump did not oppose it.
Okay, we're collecting questions. Feel free to continue to. I will have a look at them in a second. So I'll ask you one quick question and ask you to, before we pivot to those. I guess thinking about, we're in speculation mode, right? It's informed speculation, which is, I think, the best kind of speculation. But if I could ask you to think a little bit about maybe the 2 or 3 spaces to be looking at as we go forward. I mean, I guess you've already mentioned one, which is really the personnel issue for the Army, right? Related to the exhaustion and so on. There are a couple other things that have sort of come into my field of vision. Maybe these aren't the major things, but the question of grain exports is now back a little bit, right? We have a master's student working on a project on that. The question of nuclear security, again, making I don't know why this escapes attention. Maybe it's always there. It's always a consideration, but somehow it begins to make news. Obviously, the contingencies involving the U.S. elections. Maybe there are European elections that are worth thinking about. But when you're thinking about the next even 6 months, right?
Yeah.
What are the 2 or 3 major spaces you'd be interested in looking at?
Well, I mean, let's see first the kind of the changing global framework, because the war that Russia began in Ukraine is now part of a much more basically worldwide confrontation, because as a result of this war, we have seen the coalescing of this axis of autocracies. So Russia, Iran, and North Korea are in a de facto, with North Korea, formal military alliance. Ukrainians are being killed with Iranian drones and North Korean ballistic missiles. And technology is flowing the other way, helping Iran and North Korea to become more of a threat to U.S. and allied interests in their respective regions. And we have China providing all of them with political and economic cover, technologies, money, and kind of allowing Russia to stay afloat, even though there is no direct Chinese military assistance that we know of. And so all these conflicts are increasingly interconnected. And like one of the examples is that it's not the nuclear escalation that is probably the biggest fear in Washington now. It's the not what they call the vertical escalation, sort of in different types of weapons, but the horizontal one, geographical one. And I think a big fear is that, and one of the reasons why the U.S. Has not provided authorization to use long-range missiles inside Russia, is that Russia has threatened to provide the Houthis in Yemen with sophisticated anti-ship missiles that could actually sink American warships in the Red Sea, a capability they don't have right now. And so, and that is, that is much more realistic threat than nuclear weapons. So all these theaters are more and more interconnected, and I think that is the dynamic we're seeing now increasingly. I think you mentioned the grain corridor. So Ukraine was able to reopen its ports in the Black Sea by selective but demonstrative strikes on Russian port facilities for a very simple reason. Exports matter more to Russia than to Ukraine. Ukraine, at the end of the day, is fighting this war with other people's money. It's receiving weapons, it's receiving fuel, and its economy as it is has been severely battered by Russia. But nobody's going to pay Russia to fight the war. So if Russia is not able to export oil, it's not going to be able to continue the war. And Ukraine so far has not, as I said, targeted Russian energy infrastructure facilities, because doing so would also raise the price of oil in the West. And this is sort of this chicken and egg situation that, as of now, is unresolved. Because while the U.S. was very happy for European nations to suffer the pain from cutting off natural gas supplies, and actually profited from that by selling its own liquefied natural gas to Europe, the U.S. is not willing to see an increase in oil prices. That's why the sanctions on Russia or Iran are not really effective when it comes to oil trade, crude oil trade.
Great. So I'm going to pivot and turn to some questions. So these are going to be kind of a little bit disconnected from each other, Yaroslav. But we'll try to get to as many as we can.
Sure.
There's a question from a student here. Something you haven't covered is cyber warfare. Well, a little bit, but maybe you can say a little bit more. What role has cyber warfare played in the war, and what trends can we expect moving forward? I guess in the war itself, but potentially beyond this theater?
So the Russians tried, and they tried to bring down. I remember, like, Ukraine's main bank stopped, like, its website stopped working the night before the invasion. The Ukrainians prepared for this, and they very wisely put a lot of the data on cloud servers. They actually changed the law before the war to allow, putting it on cloud. And so when the Russians hacked the physical infrastructure, they were able to have backups of the information in safe locations. So actually, there wasn't much of a disruption when it started. And there's a very telling episode, I think, in the book for me. Having covered wars in many countries, you have this expectation that what people want is U.S. dollars. So we changed a lot of currency to dollars, had this stash of dollars the day before the war. And then when the invasion began and I tried to pay with the dollars in the supermarket, the lady said, but I know what the exchange rate is. I don't want to cheat you. How about Apple Pay? And Apple Pay worked. And Apple Pay worked all the way to the furthest gas station in Donbass. So we really haven't seen much of an effort to disrupt networks. I mean, we've seen effort, but we haven't seen much of an outcome. Kyivstar, Ukraine's largest mobile phone company, was hacked, I think, last year. And that had a certain effect, but the other networks were not hacked, so people were able to roam on other networks. But it wasn't really a strategic disruption.
Can you say anything about Starlink and Elon Musk?
Well, Starlink is Starlink. Elon Musk is Elon Musk.
Okay.
And he has opinions. However, Starlink was critical for the Ukrainian military, remains critical for the Ukrainian military. Communications, it's the backbone of the communications network. And I'll give you a very simple example, as relayed to me by a battalion commander of the 3rd Strike Brigade in Bakhmut. Said, I have a guy with a drone who's flying above the Russian positions, and the drone flies maybe like 5-6 kilometers, and he's standing next to his own battalion commander, who's watching it and is giving orders, and that battalion commander is at great danger. But I can sit in Konstantinivka, 20 kilometers away, and watch the through Starlink feed and be safe. And just the level of battle space coordination that the Ukrainians were able to achieve by developing their own platforms. Like every unit they have Ubers for artillery through Starlinks. So they have these tablets with drone feeds, and then artillery units just say, okay, I see this target. Is it okay to hit it? Yes, sure. What do you have? So that's critical, and the Russians don't have that. I mean, they have a little bit of Starlink now because they're buying Starlinks on the black market, but nowhere near the level of saturation that the Ukrainians have.
So Starlink is Starlink, and Elon Musk is what exactly?
Elon Musk has opinions.
Has opinions. Okay. All right. Okay. We'll leave it at that. That's fair enough. Another question from
that have not interfered, except one example, with the operations of Starlink.
Okay. Question from another student. How do you view NATO's evolving role in European security?
Well, so NATO itself is evolving. And I think, again, this election will be a test of NATO's future. NATO's biggest value is Article 5, which is an Article 5 charter that calls for all other member states to defend one of them if it's attacked. Mm-hmm. And that article is not automatic. It's optional. So every member state chooses how to respond. And even though, under new legislation in the U.S., President Trump, if he gets elected, would not be able to withdraw from NATO, it still would be his executive prerogative to decide how to react in case a NATO member is attacked. And he could choose not to react. And he had this famous interview with Tucker Carlson during his previous term, and Tucker asked him, why should American soldiers die for Montenegro? And he said, why?
Fair enough. Thinking about the broader neighborhood is another question from a different student. Taking into consideration Russia's resource exhaustion, that might be soldiers, I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on the possibility of Putin administration forcibly pulling Central Asian countries into the war through the Collective Security Treaty Organization?
Well, it's clear that Russia has a manpower shortage. It's already emptied out its prisons. It has, politically, Putin knows that a new wave of mobilization will be really unpopular, so he's trying not to forcibly mobilize ordinary Russians. They are increasing the bonuses they're paying to sign up volunteers, to a very large amount. I think the death payouts are now larger than the average salary for the remaining lifetime of the average soldier. But they're still having, they still have a shortage. So now they're recruiting people, we're seeing more and more soldiers from Africa, from Nepal, from Cuba, from India, and from Central Asia on the individual level. I think they are just like dragooning laborers all over Russian cities. However, it's very hard to imagine any of these countries joining the war because if you look at how they vote at the UN, they're not voting with Russia except Belarus. And they are actually, staying on the sidelines. And the last thing they want is to be paying the price for this war.
Absolutely. That makes sense to me. Of course, there are great opportunities, economic opportunities for those who are helping to get sanctioned goods across the borders. With a they found this sweet spot where they're balancing between Russia, China, and the U.S. and trying to stay as far as possible in this space that is beneficial to them. Okay, I need you to provide longer answers so that I can have more time to sort through all the great questions that are coming in. Okay, no more terse answers. Okay. All right, so we're sort of in the foreign policy space and actually Russia's alliances. Here's a question from somebody online. Thank you very much for your talk, ! What impact can you foresee North Korea's deepening alliance with the Kremlin might have, I guess, now that North Korean troops have deployed to relieve Russian border guards? Don't know about that.
So there has been reporting about North Korean troops entering the fight. I have not seen any independent evidence confirming this. So right now, South Korean officials have been worrying about North Korean troops training in Russia. We'll see. Honestly, it's very hard for troops from countries where people don't speak the language, don't know the culture, to be efficient. So we have not seen any units, units that are entirely made up of foreign soldiers operating. And when we've seen individual soldiers, from African countries, from India, they have not looked very professional and don't survive very long. And so they don't really pose much of a threat to Ukraine. If North Koreans were to be fighting as a unit, as a battalion or brigade, under independent command, that might be different. But so far, that hasn't happened. But what is clear is that Russia has revived a formal strategic military alliance that the Soviet Union had with North Korea. It is using North Korea ballistic missiles. It's providing North Korea with food and fuel. And there is a lot of concern in the U.S. military that they will also provide North Korea with much more tangible things like submarine technology that will allow North Korean submarines to arrive undetected to American shores. And already parts of the American West Coast are within range of North Korean nuclear ballistic missiles.
For sure. Thinking a little more about the who might be fighting on the Russian side. What about mercenary? Well, what about like Prigozhin, right? And we know the fate of it. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit for those who don't know. But there was also some talk at some point. I never could tell how realistic this was, that Cossack groups might sort of informally, become essentially mercenary groups with some degree of autonomy from the military. Is that out the window? Was that never something that was going to happen? Was there too much of a liability on the part of the army now that they to devolve kind of decision-making power to somebody like Prigozhin, who ended up having different ideas?
Yeah.
in the
So,
end?
I mean, let's roll back to the history of Wagner's involvement. So Wagner and the mercenary company created by Prigozhin, which was really staffed with the best and the brightest of the Russian military, because he would just hire away from the military and pay 3 times the salary, and then have them fight in foreign wars, where they also had a percentage of the cut from whatever, exploiting Syrian oil fields and gold in Central African Republic. So Wagner was not really used in the initial invasion. They were asked to come and help when the Russian assault on Kyiv failed, and Russia regrouped in March and April and tried to refocus on the Donbass. And that in the initial campaign, Wagner was the only Russian force that was able to break through Ukrainian defenses in advance, and was critical in taking Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, and then they focused all their energy on Bakhmut. And by then they ran out of many of these professional mercenaries, and they had this bright idea of tapping Russian prisons. So they pioneered the recruitment of, they're called Kashniki, the category K soldiers who were promised freedom and full civil rights if they survived 6 months in Ukraine. And the vast majority did not survive 6 months in Ukraine because they were just sending these waves of, they were trained for one mission. And initially, they were picking up the healthy ones, then the less healthy, and the ones I interviewed in Bakhmut towards 2023, they had HIV and lots of other health conditions, and they were really trained for this one thing. You have to go, take up this next tree line, and if you survive, great, but most will not. And when Prigozhin's and Prigozhin did take Bakhmut, but he lost by his own mission 30,000 people there. And so when his uprising failed, the Russian military absorbed Wagner as we know it, and they came up with their own units of prisoners. It's called Stormze. And Stormze, unlike Wagner's people, don't actually have a promise to go home after 6 months. They're there for the duration. And they use them in the same way. But because they don't have an equally competent officer corps, they're not as successful as Wagner used to be. So they're still fighting. But Russia doesn't have a limitless supply of prisoners, so there's fewer and fewer of those. When it comes to the Cossacks, the whole official Cossack movement was part of the Russian nationalist kind of infrastructures, since well before the initial war in Ukraine in 2014. And there are always like Cossack regiments, but it's just a label, and they'll have nice uniforms, but they're all part of the Russian military structure.
Realizing that you're, correspondent on the ground in Ukraine and not in Russia. Do we know much about the different soldiers from the Russian army that come from, let's say, ethnic minorities? I mean, there's Chechens. You make a key appearance here. I don't know,
Yeah.
Buryats and others.
Yeah, so I think, let's put the Chechens aside for now, because Chechnya is a very, I did spend a lot of time in Russia before the war, and so, before the full-scale war, and traveled to Chechnya and other places. And Chechnya is a personal union between Ramzan Kadyrov, the king and overlord and the emir of, the Chechen Islamic State, that has very different rules from the rest of Russia. There's no alcohol on sale there. Women have to, wear skirts up to the ankles, and all of that. And Putin, it's a personal union, but the writ of the Russian state as such is not really applicable to Chechnya. So it's a different country for all purposes. And the Chechen authorities have the freedom to go to Moscow and take back whoever they want for prosecution. And so there are Chechen unions that are being formed there. There is actual Chechen unions, and there is also Akhmat, which is run by Chechens, but they train the Special Forces University in Gudermes. in Chechnya, and it's recruits from all over. And they haven't really shown to be a very effective force. I mean, they've been, laughed at as the TikTok soldiers. They shoot lots of videos, but haven't been really successful. The Ukrainians like taking them prisoner because they will always be able to trade them back for their high-value targets. For example, the Chechens are good currency to get the Azov soldiers back. Now, what we know about the rest of the Russian military is that ethnic minority areas are disproportionately represented there because they're also economically deprived. So there is a lot of Buryats. Traditionally, Buryats go to be to serve in the tank forces. The big tank division is in Ulan-Ude. We know a lot of Dagestanis are serving there. But that's just been the pattern of the Russian military, I think, since forever.
Thinking just back to the Prigozhin and Wagner. I mean, of course, there's we know how he met his fate. I mean, it's in the book. Some people in the room will certainly remember it. But the Wagner was on the march, at least on the march towards Moscow on that highway, when Prigozhin had a change of heart of some kind and decided to trust Putin's word. Turned out to be a fateful decision on his part. I guess the question is, had he not made that decision, thinking again about contingencies, things that could have gone differently, what would have happened?
It's hard to tell. I mean, there were troops waiting for them with orders to fight them. Would they have fought, like when it actually came to to crunch? We don't know because it didn't happen. It's clear that Prigozhin was expecting more open support from within the ranks of the Russian military that didn't materialize. And, he did make this fateful mistake of trusting Lukashenko and Putin as assurances about his personal safety. But what it does tell us that, nobody really expected this to happen until a few days before that. And this again goes to this idea that Russia is a very hard place, but also very brittle. And so you never know when is the next crack going to happen and what can cause it.
I guess that's a kind of a hope, right?
For some. In Ukraine, for sure.
Well, okay, fair enough. Let's actually pivot just a tiny bit. There are some questions here that I think get more into personal, professional life, right? So this is in that vein. Thank you for being here today. You write about heroes, and you are a hero yourself.
Oh.
What moments from the first 3 years of the war affected you most personally? And again, just reminding the audience that you're from Ukraine. You've covered wars elsewhere, which must play itself out in kind of a different sort of psychological register than this one. This person goes on, you likely witnessed war crimes. Which was the hardest to believe, okay, not quite sure, was real human action? In a broader sense, how have Putin's atrocities changed over time? If you could just reflect on sort of how it might affect you personally, or how you deal with that as a professional journalist, right?
Well, I mean, the biggest coping mechanism is to write about it. And I already felt it. I saw a lot of unpleasant things when I was in Baghdad in 2003, 4, 5. And at the time, writing a book about what happened and the losses and the friends who were killed and kidnapped was actually very liberating, because once you put it to paper, you sort of you get out of the system. And I think this book also helped in that way. I think if you ask me about the moment that kind of stands out, it's actually the moment that I remember the most was in Liman. So that's I'd say September 2022. And this is a city that Ukrainian troops had just retaken from the Russians. So the Russians left in the night, and we just drove there, I'd say like 5 a.m. It was still mist. And ahead of us, only the first initial Ukrainian special forces had come in. And so we just found ourselves driving through the forest on this road where a retreating Russian column had been ambushed, just a couple of hours earlier. And I've seen a large amount of dead Russian soldiers until then. But they had been lying around for days, decomposing, kind of not really bloating, not really looking human. Whereas these guys were like young, handsome guys, maybe a dozen of them, lying around. And they, this sort of morning mist, they seemed alive. They didn't even seem dead. And I remember just walking around and thinking like, okay, these are the people who've come to murder and pillage in Ukraine. However, they could all have had very different lives. And I just kept thinking about, this guy's wife is probably calling him on his phone and, and not getting any signal. And, you like, as Ukrainians very rarely empathize with the invading soldiers. However, seeing the absurdity of it all, I think was really emotionally powerful. Like, why? Why did it have to happen? Why did you have to die?
Is there sort of a fraternity of, war correspondents where you share things with each other that you can't share necessarily with a reader? I mean, or is that, I guess more broadly, is there coordination? I mean, there are multiple Wall Street Journal correspondents in this space, right? Actually, I don't know how many there are, but is there kind of a coordination of tasks and of duties and of stories that you're following?
Yeah, of course, but also, with our supposed rivals, our publications could be competitors, but, in the fields we're very often comrades because, like physical survival depends on, knowledge about, what's around this corner and can we go, how safe it is, what did you see? So there's a lot of camaraderie. It's not about not telling, having secrets. We don't have secrets, I hope we don't have secrets, I think our job is to be honest with our readers and not to hide anything important from them.
Absolutely. There's a question here about Evan Gershkovich. And have you had the opportunity for a one-on-one with him? Have you had any chats? Has he said anything that you can tell us?
I've, nothing I can tell you, but yes, I had a very nice dinner with Evan a couple of weeks ago.
The wine was lovely.
And so were the oysters.
Okay.
Which he did not have in the Portofay prison for a year and a half.
Okay.
All I can tell you that, I asked him if he wants to go for a borscht, and he said he had enough borscht.
He's had enough borscht. Okay. That's absolutely fair. There are a couple of questions online that let me group together because I think they're bringing. We haven't spoken much about China. Oh, you know what? I didn't want to do that. I actually wanted to talk to you about your book, your fiction book, because once we're in the personal space, and you tell us to what degree you're comfortable. But as I understand this, it's a book of fiction, right? Maybe you can say a little bit more about it. And I understand, at least from the blurbs, that it's at least partially inspired by your own family history, or at least a reconstruction of that family history.
Yeah.
I think that might be useful to sort of bring together sort of how you come to to think about this space in the way that you do, and also maybe so that people get a sense of what the book is about.
Yeah, so for those who came late, that's the book again, No Country for Love, and it's coming out in North America in February, but it's already available as a Kindle. So it's a novel, but it really is based on my grandmother's life, and I'm thinking of it as a prequel to this book because it's set in the 1930s and 40s and 1950s, at a time when Ukraine really was the deadliest place on earth. If you remember what was happening there at the time, there was the Holodomor, the artificial famine that killed millions, caused cannibalism in the villages. Then there was what the Ukrainians called, the executed Renaissance, the basically physical extermination of Ukraine's, painters, writers, artists, the entire intellectual elite. Then World War II, the Holocaust, the destruction of Ukrainian cities. Then when the rest of Europe was resuming peaceful life, there was an insurgency that lasted another decade in many parts of Ukraine. And millions and millions of people in Ukraine died at the time. And the people who survived had to go through some really terrible moral choices very often, compromises to protect themselves, to protect their children, their loved ones. And everyone who is alive in Ukraine today is descended from the survivors of those times. And we all carry this memory in our bones and the sense of never again And I think that's really explaining why Ukrainians are making the sacrifices nobody expects them to make today on the front lines, because there is this understanding, unspoken understanding, that surrender to Russia would be a return to those times, a return to the dark past. And the Russian government is not, hiding its intentions. I think it's very telling that whenever the Russian military seizes a Ukrainian town, the first thing they do is destroy the monument to the victims of the famine of the Holodomor, because they claim it, it never existed, or it was not directed against Ukrainians. And so I started writing this novel in 2014 when I was in Kabul. And everybody was very interested in the Afghan elections, who will win. The future of Western democracy depended on the electoral process in the Afghan Republic, apparently. And so I couldn't go to Ukraine, and I was shocked by how little people knew about Ukraine, its history, its society, and how whatever was known through Russian eyes, through the eyes of the colonial power of the past. And the stories of my family are very common, I think, to so many other families in Ukraine, because everyone went through this horrible period and then didn't speak about it. It was all hidden. It was so much shame and fear. And I finished writing this book in 2021, just before the full-scale invasion. And there are scenes in there of World War II, of Kyiv under shelling, which then became reality just a few months after I finished the book, which was kind of very eerie for me. It's like, oh, well, I'm on St. Sophia Square, and it's happening in real life.
Was it hard to write, or was it cathartic, or was it a slog?
It was hard. It was very hard. Also, as a journalist, you have to unlearn so many skills of your craft to write fiction.
Well, you weren't on the same kind of deadline.
No, 8 years.
8-year deadline. Okay, that's
8 years.
That's almost an academic trajectory for books. Maybe not quite. We'll take even longer than that. Okay, some questions about. Actually, you mentioned Afghanistan, and there's a question here somewhere in the welter that I've lost now sight of. But it basically amounted to this: What are some of the principal similarities and differences that you see between the conflict as it developed, and of course in the Afghan case ended, if we're taking the Taliban takeover as an end. So in that context versus Ukraine. So what are some of the key things? And I think the maybe behind the question lurks maybe a deeper question about, are there lessons, right, that one might learn from the Afghan case that might be applicable?
Well, I mean, obviously, the Russian propaganda is pushing the wrong lesson. It's all futile. You will lose. Just cut your losses. But I think fundamentally, these two conflicts could not be more different. And I'm saying this, having spent 5 years and then another half a year in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, it was a conflict between different groups of Afghans. The Taliban, despite all their atrocious human rights record, did have a constituency in southern and eastern Afghanistan where maybe not the majority, but a significant part of the population did support them. And Afghanistan was a war in which the Republic of Afghanistan was propped up by the American military from the very beginning, and a war in which Americans and Canadians had to die to protect it. And it could only last, as we have seen, as long as the foreigners were there to prop it up. And this knowledge was there. Since I first came to Afghanistan in 2004, there was this understanding by everyone involved in running the government, in running the political system, in doing business, that this bonanza would only last as long as the foreigners are here. Therefore, let's steal as much as we can. And that's why we saw this, mind-boggling corruption there, because everybody knew that once the party ends, that's it. That's not like that in Ukraine. no Americans are dying, no Canadians are dying to save Ukraine. Ukraine defended itself on its own. There is no Ukrainians supporting the Russians, a very small number. But it's not a civil war the way it was in Afghanistan. And it's also there is a belief that Ukraine eventually will prevail, which puts a natural check on corruption because the society reacts to this. And while we have seen many examples of corruption in Ukraine, we know about them because independent press, independent watchdogs are reporting on this, and decisions are being made, and there has been ministers, deputy ministers fired and put in jail because of that.
Okay, thinking about maybe this is related. I think it is because it's again there's a minority of Republicans who are either on principle, or maybe they're simply just drinking the Kool-Aid that ultimately comes from Russian propaganda. But they're basically making this analogy, and they're saying we can't waste, we can't throw good money after bad. We need to end this. Or maybe there's a more subtle version of it, which is to say that it's not being as effective. It's diminishing returns. This is the time to rethink, and so on and so forth. So the question that's come from a student is, how important is the upcoming American election to the war on a scale from 1 to 10? And we're going to hold you to the number, right, 1 to 10. And I guess I would add the following sort of, depending on your answer, what happens to the prosecution of the war absent U.S. support? Like, let's imagine a total end of U.S. support, or at least a radical winding down of U.S. support.
Yeah.
What happens to the war effort? What happens to the Western coalition? What happens to the mood of soldiers or ordinary citizens in Ukraine in that context?
I don't know. It's hard to put a number. It is important. It is very important. I'm not gonna have a number just because we don't know what Trump will do. I think most people in Ukraine are rooting for Vice President Harris to win, but not everyone. There are people in Ukraine who are very frustrated with the slow decision-making by the current administration and are hoping for some decisiveness. So what will happen if U.S. goes cold turkey and Ukraine cuts off aid? The question is, what will the Europeans do? Right now, the Europeans account for the majority of aid to Ukraine. They don't necessarily have the industrial capacity, but they're building it. Right. Next year, just the artillery ammunition production in Europe will be enough to cover Ukraine's needs, which is not the case. Was not the case earlier this year. And there, it also depends on the political movements within Europe, which are really hard to predict. And, probably Poland and the Baltic states and Finland and Sweden and the UK will continue helping Ukraine. What happens in Germany and France is harder to predict. In Germany, you have on the left and on the right. Between AfD on the far right and the Wagenknecht's party on the far left, sort of support for appeasement of Russia, if not Russia outright. How will the German government look after the elections next year, at the time when the German economy is no longer growing? Who knows? So again, hard to predict. But also, Russia's resources are also not limitless. Right now they're losing several times more tanks and fighting vehicles in every week than they can make or refurbish. So they will also start to run out of, not necessarily men, of hardware. And then again, we go back to the question of Ukraine also has agency. And it's a two-edged sword. Ukraine receiving assistance also means that its behavior is restrained. And it's not doing lots of things that would help it, but would not be welcomed by its partners and allies. So it could take the gloves off.
Yeah. If you have anything to add, somebody online asks about Hungary and Slovakia in particular, saying that on the one hand, about the prime ministers, who on the one hand are openly pro-Russian at home, but then on the other hand support, maybe grudgingly, Ukraine as a matter of foreign policy. Is that a fragile arrangement? Is it something that they're going to be called upon to resolve ultimately?
Okay, I think Slovakia and Hungary are slightly different frameworks. So if you look at Viktor Orban, he started off his career as being very much anti-Russian. He was, the hero of the anti-Soviet opposition in the 90s. He changed his tune, and he's trying to position himself as, Putin's and Trump's best interlocutor in Europe. But I think he can do it only as long as he feels that he's actually secure within NATO. And I had a conversation about this with a senior official in a much bigger European country. We're like, well, if Trump pulls out of Europe, where is Orban going to run? He's going to run to us, say, please protect me. And in fact, what we have seen is that when it comes to actual decisions, despite all his rhetoric, he allows NATO and the European Union to make these decisions to help Ukraine. When the European Union voted on this $50 billion package for Ukraine earlier this year, he just stepped out of the room, saying, I disagree, but did not block it. Mm-hmm. Slovakia is a new arrival. I think Slovakia is symptomatic also of the psychological changes in Europe, because as people see Russia gaining in the battlefield, some people react by building up defenses, other people react by thinking, well, maybe we should appease them. And I think many Slovaks decided that it's safer to appease Russia. And that's why they voted Fico back into power.
Talked about elections across Europe. One place where elections, there are no elections in Russia of any.
There are elections, we just know the outcome.
Yeah, we know the outcome, that's right. In Ukraine, there are no elections. There's, there's martial law and so on. So I guess the question is, when might we expect elections? And let me add on to that. That's a question from online. Let me bundle a couple of sort of thoughts here. I guess the secondary question might be, if elections were actually, if one could hold elections, what kind of outcome would one expect? And then a third question, I think these are related potentially. Somebody in the room asked, do Ukrainians themselves fear nuclear escalation, right? In other words, would fear have some kind of role in how they, for example, vote, if a vote were to actually be held?
Yeah, so, President Zelensky's term technically ended in May this year. Ukrainian law does not allow elections in wartime, and there is a historical parallel with the United Kingdom. There were no elections in the UK from 1939 until 1945, so Parliament just kept extending itself until war in Europe ended. So there is no political pressure within Ukraine to have an election soon. Nobody of any stature is calling for an election, if only because they probably know that if it were held today, at wartime, with all the wartime restrictions, it would be much harder to oust a president during war. Whereas again, going back to the British example, after the war ends, there'll be a reckoning. There'll be lots of questions about what really happened in the run-up to the war. Why was Ukraine so unprepared? And Churchill did not win re-election after World War II. And if you look at Ukraine's historical records, Zelensky is the 6th president of Ukraine. Only one Ukrainian president has been re-elected, President Kuchma. So Ukrainians don't really like re-electing incumbents.
Yeah, okay, I think that makes total sense. What about the nuclear thing? Does that play into people's views of the right course of action with regard to this conflict, or is that too abstract and not immediate enough?
I think Ukrainians just no longer believe that this is a realistic threat, and they have to contend with enough actual bad things happening, missiles and drones raining on the cities pretty much every night.
Okay. I need longer answers, Yaroslav. You're not helping me.
I cannot speak for every Ukrainian, but I'm just not seeing this nuclear threat being discussed.
That's fair. That's
in
fair.
any serious way.
Thinking about a reckoning, going.
And there was a joke there, so it was really funny. In October 2022, when this fear was at its maximum, there was this Facebook group in Kyiv being formed saying that, if the nuclear holocaust is upon us, let's all go to Shikavica Mountain in Kyiv, where we'll have, alcohol, drugs, and group sex. And at some point, there was a statement made, I think, by Zelensky's spokesman, and somebody asked him, is it time to go to Shikavica yet or not? He said, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, not time. All right, the questions keep coming. I did want to ask you, thinking, I guess, forward, we don't know what a reckoning would look like, and that, is in turn contingent upon how the war ends, how long it takes, and so on and so forth. But I guess thinking back, if you can reconstruct your thoughts, were you surprised by how prepared Ukraine was for the war, or how unprepared Ukraine was for the war? Like, I'll tell you where I'm coming from here. I was surprised that, and I guess I, was following the line from a lot of Western governments, which is that Ukraine didn't stand a chance. So to me, if they had lasted a month, that already was exceeding my very low expectations. Okay, so that says more about me as an analyst than anything else. But nonetheless, where do you position yourself with regard to that surprise?
Well, having gone to, pretty much throughout Eastern and I guess Northern, so all over the border areas, it was pretty clear to me that the people there will not be switching sides and supporting Russia, which was a big takeaway from that. And then it was touch and go on the first day, but on day two, I remember once Zelensky came out and gave his famous, it was probably the most famous turning point of the war, when he came out with this camera outside his headquarters on Bankova in Kyiv with his minister saying, we are here, we'll not go anywhere. At the time when Russian television was, broadcasting that he's already fled to Lviv or Vienna or whatever. I think that had a giant psychological impact. And I remember driving through Kyiv the next morning and seeing thousands and thousands of people just coming out of the high rises and going to pick up weapons and heading to the front with very little training. And I caught myself thinking that, if Kyiv holds out another day or two, it will then not fall at all. And in fact, once Ukraine got over the initial shock, it got its act together very quickly. And, part of the merit goes to General Zaluzhny, who did enough to prepare at least parts of the military. He saved the Air Force, he saved the air defenses by dispersing them in time. Even the guys in Hostomel, they were not in the barracks when the missile hit, and so Hostomel was not taken. So while there are lots of failures on the part of the Ukrainian government in the run-up to the war, they did just enough not to be overrun, and then organize themselves to push back.
There are a couple of questions online that have to do with China, one way or another. Let me see if I can group them together. Thanks you so much for your talk. I want to ask, given China's balancing act between bankrolling Russia's operations and maintaining quote-unquote neutrality on Ukraine, would we see increased cooperation between China and Russia on Ukraine, or would China continue to stay at arm's length away from further cooperation? So that's number one. And if you don't mind the second one, I think they're linked. Thank you for your insightful talk. I'm curious, how do you see the ongoing Ukraine-Russia war influencing U.S.-Taiwan relations, particularly given the continuous military threat from China? Are there specific lessons or shifts in U.S. policy from the Ukraine conflict that might shape its approach to Taiwan's security and regional stability in the Pacific? Obviously, this is getting, you're a well-read guy. This is getting a little bit beyond,
I am actually, I would love to talk about Taiwan because I was,
okay, go.
I was interested in this very question, and I went to Taiwan to look into it in great detail. And so I'll maybe start with the second question. Taiwan is small. Ukraine, the occupied areas in Ukraine are about, I think, 5 times the size of Taiwan. More importantly, it doesn't have, I think, when the Taiwanese look at the war in Ukraine, I think the reaction is very simple for many people, is do we want to be Hong Kong which is okay, no longer free under Chinese rule, but kind of nice and prosperous and shiny, or do you want to become Mariupol? And I think a lot of the Taiwanese would rather be Hong Kong. I went to the main intersection in Taipei last year and just talked to, I don't know, maybe like 40 young men. And out of them, only 2 said, we will fight the Chinese if they come invade us. The rest said, no, it's hopeless. It's kind of our motherland anyway. And unlike the Ukrainian military, the Taiwanese military has a very, very bad reputation among many Taiwanese for 2 reasons. I mean, first of all, it is the most Soviet military in existence, because if you look at the history of Guomindang, it was created by Soviet instructors in South China in the 1920s, and then when the communists took over China, that Soviet-style military moved to Taiwan and kind of stayed like that ever since, while the actual PLA in China reformed, modernized, and adopted more modern structures. And then the military in Taiwan was a military of mainlanders, not Taiwanese, initially, was instrumental in a very oppressive regime that only ended not so long ago, just a few decades ago. And so there is still this great divide between society. And so Taiwan is spending on its defense, like 2.5% of its GDP, which is, not the kind of commitment you make if you face an existential threat. And the U.S. Would only come to fight for Taiwan if the Taiwanese themselves choose to fight. And I'm just not sure they will. It's just my gut feeling, at least the way things are now. And if you're China, all right, what is your position now? You're watching, you're in a great position right now, because you're watching as your principal enemy, the UN, geopolitical rival, let's put it this way. The United States is exhausting itself militarily by, drawing down its weapons and ammunition stocks in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Your other potential threat, Russia, is also getting weaker and more dependent on you, which means you can drive a much harder bargain to get Russian oil and gas. What's not to like? They can go forever.
Yeah, surely that's the story in Central Asia. We can see palpably China's winning in that sense. Okay, a couple other things, and then I think we'll begin to wind down. But so you're well read. Apparently, you've been to places like Taiwan as well. Can you say which authors or journalists do you find particularly insightful or interesting with respect to geopolitical affairs? Shout out to a few names. Don't leave anybody off the list.
No, I mean, look, I think I'm all into fact-based journalism. So I think, our paper, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, they all have great reporting from where things are happening. I don't want to name any names. It's just, there are fewer and fewer sources of facts in the world, just because it's very expensive and hard to report properly. And so the few institutions that still have the courage and the money and the ability to do it, I think we should all support them and read what they write.
Okay, so support all journalists doing good work.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Pivoting somewhat awkwardly.
How awkward?
There's somebody named Anastasia Trofimova.
Right, no relation of mine.
That was the first question. The second question is, do you have any perspective or opinion on this film that was controversial and was briefly shown at our film festival here called Russians at War? Do you know it?
So I have not seen the film, and so I cannot make any comments on the film I have not seen. However, I know that the Toronto Film Festival said that the film was made without any permission or authorization of the Russian military, which is not only implausible, but also runs in the face of what Trofimov herself had said about a brigade commander there telling her to wear the Russian uniform, because otherwise you may be mistakenly shot by my man, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about the environment where she operated.
Fair enough. Okay, a couple questions which are truly forward-looking and increasingly speculative, okay? But asking you to sort of use your, use what you've learned, what you've experienced, and of course, what you've thought through in ways that are, deeper than most of us are able to do. First question from a student, how do you persuade the West to keep supporting Ukraine? Let me actually sort of do a footnote here. Is the language of Ukraine is fighting for all of us and saving democracy, is that the message? Is that enough?
Well, I think it's certainly the message that resonates in those parts of the West that are right next to Ukraine. And, I remember, when I first left Ukraine after the full-scale invasion and drove into Krakow, there were all the stickers on fast food carts there saying, Ukrainian soldiers are dying, for you to be free here. And it is a fact because President Putin has not hidden his intentions to go further. We have seen, I mean, how did it all begin, right? It all began with him essentially making an ultimatum saying we want NATO to be rolled back from its presence in the new countries, the former Soviet satellites, basically making a claim to a sphere of influence in NATO and EU members in Eastern and Central Europe. The next year, he came to St. Petersburg to the anniversary of Emperor Peter the Great and said, well, I have to follow in his footsteps to collect lands, and Narva is Russian land, which is a city in Estonia, a member of NATO and the EU. Obviously, the further away you are from Russia, the less that argument resonates. Canada is really far away. However, the oceans no longer protect you as much as they used to. We talked about North Korean ballistic missiles, being able to reach Pacific shores of the U.S. and Canada now. So distances are shrinking, and Russia has not shied away from using hybrid methods to assassinate and, all other sort of mayhem already on NATO territory. So a Russia that is not stopped in Ukraine will be a much stronger Russia. It will have the most sophisticated military in the world in terms of combat experience in modern warfare. And it will have Ukraine's manpower that it could recruit and use for the next step. We have already saw this play out in Donbass, because what was the first thing that happened before the full-scale invasion? The Russians took off the street pretty much every able-bodied man in Donetsk and Luhansk, areas they occupied 8 years earlier, and sent them to fight other Ukrainians. And pretty much everyone there is dead now.
Sobering, of course. This is a question from a student. Is there any chance, and please say there's a chance, for both Ukrainians and Russians to be two friendly nations? And if so, what needs to be done, apart, of course, from ending the war? What would it take?
Well, ending the war and ending the occupation. And, atonement on the part of Russia, of the Russian state, for all the crimes that had been committed in the last many years in Ukraine.
Say more. Atonement. I mean, are these? Is that something that one can imagine? Under what circumstances does that become marginally more likely?
Well, I mean,
at the moment it strikes me as a bit hard to imagine, given.
Well, I mean, the prerequisite for atonement would be a massive political change in Russia, which likely can only be triggered by a defeat in a war. Yeah. I mean, we have seen the Japanese society atone, partially at least, for the sins of the past. Certainly Germany has gone through the entire process of denazification and rethinking its past and its legacy. Russia is probably the only empire in the world that has never gone through sort of de-imperialization. Because if we talk about the British Empire, right? Okay, we like Kipling, but we also know that Kipling was a bard of imperialism and all the horrible things were happening in India under the Raj, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not just putting Kipling on a pedestal without the historical context. But if you look at all the great names of Russian literature, Pushkin, Dostoevsky, all the way to Joseph Brodsky, they were imperialists to the core. Pushkin famously, said, "Varsavia delendum est," Warsaw must be razed to the ground because they dared to rise against the Russian Tsar. Dostoevsky pushed for, seizing Constantinople in the name of Russian glory. And Brodsky, the poet laureate of the United States, wrote a poem on the independence of Ukraine saying, I want to spit into the Dnieper River so it flows backward and drowns and then he used the basically equivalent of the N-word for the Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And so that cultural decolonization has not happened in Russia. And that's a prerequisite for Russia establishing normal relations with its neighbors.
That is a long-term prospect.
Well, it took Germany a long time.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, and then the final question, I guess, in a way you started to answer it, but how do you think that this war will most likely be assessed, let's say, 50 years from now, particularly by the West?
Well, I think it's certainly a war in which, it's the first war since, the Finnish resistance in 1940, in which a nation stood up to Russia and won. Or at least, was not defeated. I don't know if it won, but it won its independence. It preserved its independence. May not preserve all its territory, but... And I think we're also skeptical about the values of Western societies, freedom, democracy, human rights, the European dream in Europe. And as the world was kind of so disillusioned in this post-fact universe, all of a sudden Ukrainians showed that they are willing to fight and die for these values that, we kind of forgot about. And I think it's a very important moral message.
We certainly took them for granted and in
sure.
a way continue to do so. Actually, let me end on this question for you. What's next for you? I mean, you've got a highly acclaimed book of fiction, this terrific nonfiction account. You're up for numerous prizes. Are you going back to Ukraine? Is there something else that you can tell us about?
Yeah, well, I'm sort of back to my day job as the chief foreign affairs correspondent of the Wall Street Journal. So, and before this, I was, in the Middle East, and lots of things are happening there as well. So I'm trying to write about all these major crises in the world that are now interconnected in very nefarious ways, and also trying to write my books. So another novel in the works.
Perfect. Well, congratulations on everything so far. You've enlightened us a lot here. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Please join me in thanking Yaroslav.